Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, and if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you. I hope that you return for future episodes once you listen to tonight's episode. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back, and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and of course, insightful. So before we get into the main event for today, if you are on YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes of the podcast and also to support the network. And for those who want to financially donate to help us keep building this platform and bringing on these phenomenal educators, you can donate through Cash App with the handle #IDTALK4ED or through Venmo with the handle @Kwame SM. And to catch past episodes of the podcast, you can go to our main website at identitytalk4educators.com. Thank you so much for the support. All right, y'all. So today we're going to be talking about a very important topic. And I know we're at a stage right now where some of us are probably thinking, man, we talking about anti-racism again, anti-racism this, anti-racism that. I get it. It's another one of those terms that came in with a lot of power and it's been co-opted, it's been appropriated over the past few years. But I promise you, today's episode is one that you want to stick around for because we're going to be talking about how we can develop anti-racist practices in the English language arts classroom. So think about all the book bans that are happening. Think about all the anti-CRT rhetoric and propaganda and legislation that's being pushed out there. Think about the socio-political climate that we find ourselves in right now as we're speaking, as we're engaging with each other. It is critical, it's crucial that we have this conversation. And what better person to have come on the podcast today than Keisha Rembert, who is the author of the book Anti-Racism in the ELA Classroom. So without further ado, I want to bring on Keisha to the podcast to talk with us about her new book, but also her overall journey as an educator. So let's bring on Keisha.
Hey,
Hello.
hi, how you doing?
How we doing?
I'm doing
Not bad.
thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm on the lineup of stars. You've had like the stars come on, so I'm feeling like I'm feeling so good to be here with
It's a pleasure to have you on. It's an honor. Um, Brianna told me so much about you, and she said, "Kwame, you got to have Keisha on. She is brilliant. She's phenomenal, and she is somebody that you need to have a conversation with." So here we are, about to have a conversation.
Well, I'm ready for it. I'm so excited about it. I love what you said about anti-racism and this term that we have somehow gotten desensitized to. But when we think of it in terms of anti-racism, it's just humanization of all people. And as educators, it is our job to create better societies for students. And that's all anti-racism does. So we can't get tired of talking about that, I'm sure.
And we're not gonna stop talking about it today. So we're gonna get right in. But actually, before we get into the main thing, we got to go back in time. So we know that before we all got into education, we had lives prior to that. So I wanted to give you opportunity to just share with our audience, who and what inspired you to want to become an educator in the first place.
Complex question, because I can be honest, I never, I've met some people who said that since they were a little kid, they knew they wanted to be a educator, and that isn't my journey. Even when I think about my first teachers, my first classroom experience, I don't equate it to a traditional classroom. I think of it in terms of my parents and my grandparents and my grandparents sitting on the living room floor of my grandparents' home and having them share stories of our ancestors, of Black brilliance, of folklore with us. And so I think that is my first classroom. And I think that's what inspires me to want to continually learn and unlearn and share that with others. My parents are migrants from the Jim Crow South. They came to Chicago. I'm Chicagoan, born and raised, and they came to Chicago from Mississippi and Alabama. And they have often talked to me about their educational experience and how their brilliance wasn't recognized in the classroom, and who they are wasn't cultivated. And that was part of them, the era in which they grew up, unfortunately. But I would venture to say that also not a lot has changed, unfortunately. I am an
Right.
educator because I want to see the brilliance of all children realized in classrooms, and for them to have it realized for themselves. And so when I think about education, I think about my parents who overcame so much and have instilled in my brother and I the 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 power, really the power that's always in us. It's not that as an educator, I go and empower children or teachers have empowered me. Power has
Right.
always existed within me, but that power of learning, the power of being able to express and comprehend and apply is so important in the world that we live in. And it creates change and it creates a betterment for society. So I think that that's what inspires me as an educator, and it's definitely my parents who were my first teachers, who were my inspiration.
So in doing my research, I know that your grandparents played a major role in the work that you do right now, and we'll get more into that as we get deeper into the conversation. But let's just go back to your own K-12 schooling. So we all went through this same system where we dealt with our share of indoctrination. We've
Mm,
dealt with our share of conditioning that has informed a lot of the things that we perceive and we believe about not just our country, but also just the things that we see in our everyday lives. But I'm curious to know, what were some of those internal or external struggles, if any, that you experienced as you were trying to figure out who you are as an individual and how you see yourself within that school space, whether we're talking elementary, middle, high school, even K to 16. I wanted to give you a chance to just share, if any, those struggles that you had.
Ooh, there are a lot of them. I could keep you here all day talking about this topic, but I think about it, it goes back again to my parents, right? So my parents, I grew up on
Yeah.
the Chicago, and the South Side of Chicago has so many stereotypes associated with it, right? You hear the news and you think that it's a barren wasteland. Well, it is not. And my parents sacrificed as hardworking, middle class folk to send my brother and I to a Catholic school. They were concerned that Chicago public schools was so big that they wanted us to have kind of this individualized experience where we weren't kind of eaten up by a system and spit out. And they knew that their own educational experiences, they had been kind of chewed up and spit out and not really allowed to thrive in the ways that they knew that they wanted us, the things that they wanted for us. So they sent us to Catholic school, and my brother and I went to Catholic school. And one of the first things that I remember was being going to school in my own community, but feeling like school kind of created this divide and this othering of who I was
Yeah.
in school versus who I was out of school. So, in this Catholic school space, I was taught by nuns who, in this really all black neighborhood. We lived in a neighborhood where we could go grocery shopping, we could go skating, we had world-class theater, the Regal Theater. Whatever we needed, we existed within our neighborhood. And so these nuns who lived in our neighborhood, but yet didn't look like us, and and saw my neighborhood so very differently than I saw it. So when I looked at my neighborhood, I thought about the people who were so kind and generous and genius, like who could help me with my homework, who could feed me, who could mend my scuffed knee when I needed it, who helps my parents out and watched my brother and I until they got home from work, who really rallied around each other as community. And I saw those assets in my community. But when I went to school, though that wasn't the picture of blackness that school portrayed for me. The picture of blackness that I got in school
Oh,
was this picture of you need to get out of this neighborhood. Like this is dangerous for you. And I'm like, oh,
right.
that is so contrary to what I see on a daily basis in this community. And yet I never saw it was weird because I lived in this area where you kind of knew everybody, you saw everybody. I never saw the nuns out at my grocery store. I never saw them when I went to the different spaces, but they were telling me that it was dangerous. And then the people that we were studying in school, the books that we were reading were never ones with characters that looked like me. They were never ones that were affirming my greatness. They were never ones that were talking about the great things that not even just people of the past, because I think we could talk about historical figures. During Black History Month, they we talked about Dr. King, we talked about Rosa Parks, but then there was never any
Yeah, usual
current.
suspects.
Exactly. There were never any contextualized people of the present where I could look at and say, and I lived in Chicago. At the time that I was going to school, we had a Black mayor who was phenomenal, who was doing amazing things, Harold Washington in the city of Chicago. And yet we never talked about people like that. We never talked about people that were proximate and local to where I lived. And so even when I talk about in the anti-racist English language arts classroom, I think that's why I'm so passionate about talking about localizing learning for students. Students should never leave that classroom not knowing people in the neighborhood, the community that they live in, that are those amazing individuals who are doing great things. That's really important because when I didn't see that, I started to question who I was. Did I need to change as a result? Did I really need to leave this neighborhood in order to be successful? And that happened even in high school. In high school, I remember I've always been a lover of English. So it's no surprise that I became an English teacher because ultimately that was something that I loved even in school. But I remember being in some advanced classes, English classes. And in high school, I remember really struggling in those classes. Well, wait a minute. I
Mhm.
know I know that this is my jam. I know that this is an area that I am gifted and talented in because my mom and my daddy told me that. And my mom and daddy are gifted speakers and readers and writers. So I know that I have that. My lineage has that's something that we pride ourselves on being storytellers. And so I got into this classroom and I kept bumping up against a teacher who I couldn't necessarily get the grade that I felt like I deserved. And so I started like collaborating with classmates. And it's like, okay, what did you get on this assignment? Can I read yours? And like really kind of like seeing what was this teacher looking for. And when I read other people's work who were racially different than they were the white students in the class. I found that their work was no different than mine. Maybe there was some black vernacular that I used. That my writing was central to my experience. I remember a myth assignment we had to write, and I steeped it in Black culture, and I didn't get a good grade on that. And so, what that communicated to me, Kwame, was that I had to change who I was to be academically acceptable. And I started to do that. And I started to do that because we often what's prized in school is a grade and acceptance from your teacher. And so you then do what you have to do in order to that for that transaction to work. And so in that transaction, I had to change myself. And I started to acquiesce to what teachers wanted. That continued even in college. I remember my um in college, I really felt out of place. There is a book that I love now, being an educator, by Beverly Tatum. Why do all the Black folks sit together in the cafeteria? And I think about myself at that point. I was scared. I was too scared to sit with all the Black folks in the cafeteria. I felt that by associating with people who looked like me, being a Black girl from the South Side of Chicago, that I was going to experience some stereotyping, some prejudice. And I did not want to have to exist in stereotype threat. And so my voice went up an octave and I sounded differently and I talked a little um, more of the King's English, we shall say, and really tried to change who I was instead of leaning in really. And it was a girl called me out on it, Kwame. I remember towards the end of the year, a Black student came and she's like, I have not seen you at any Black student union meetings. I haven't seen you at any student government meetings. Where have you been? And the question shook me because I didn't even realize I was missed. I was so busy um, trying to assimilate that I didn't even realize what I was that I was missing a part of myself. And I'm so glad that she called me out and that she called me in, and I was able to start going to Black student union meetings and really found a community. It was a little late, and I wish I would have done more, but that fear of being put in a box really limited me. So those were some struggles that I have, and I continue to have even as a teacher, teaching in um, majority white school district, being one of three teachers of color that I struggle with. Where do I push without being a pushy Black woman? Where do I use where do I lean into my identity versus pulling back on my identity? There were always these choices that I felt like I had to
Right.
make.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned this part because we're now in this stage where you're now in the classroom and you found yourself, or you're still finding yourself,
Mhm.
whichever way you want to put it. Now, here's a fact about us as Black educators. Typically, when we get into the profession, particularly in that first year, it's all about survival. We're trying to negotiate how we manifest in the different spaces we're in. We're policing how much we're talking.
Mm.
We're even policing our tone. We're policing how we present ourselves in terms of attire, right? Hair, all these things. We're doing these audits on ourselves before anyone else is doing it to us. So, my question for you is, when you first came into your school district, were you walking on eggshells, or do you just come in just guns blazing?
Well, I'll talk about my 2 experiences because when I first started teaching. First of all, I didn't come to education from a traditional route, so that also
Sure.
um, it also fed into my own insecurity and how I came into the profession. So I was originally I wanted to be Oprah. So I was a journalist major in college, and after doing some work in journalism, found that it wasn't the course that best suited me. Even though in school my teachers had told me you would make a great teacher, I thought they don't make enough money. I'm not going to be no teacher, and so I had professors to tell me this all the time, but that just wasn't a seed that really germinated for me then. It wasn't until I got out of school, started working as a journalist, and I was like, "Hey, this isn't for me." And I needed extra money, to be honest. So I was like, "Hey, I remember my teachers told me that I would be a good teacher. I'll just substitute to make some money until I find what I really want to do and I'm passionate about it." And that substituting, it got me. It got me right away. I was like, "Oh, wow. This is where I'm supposed to be." And eventually end up being a parapro in a sped preschool classroom, and those kids had my heart. Like, oh my goodness, I could not think of not doing anything but teach. So I came in through an alternative certification program to teaching where I was getting my master's while also a full-time teacher in the classroom. So that led to some insecurities for me. So when I came into education, I kind of felt like I was tiptoeing in because I didn't really know what I didn't fully know what I was doing. Um, I was still learning what it meant to be a great instructor. And I know we all talk about the fact that we wish we could go back and redo those first couple of years with students, but I didn't know what I didn't
Yep.
know. And so I did kind of ease into teaching because I was questioning myself. And by the time I moved to the second district where I spent the most time teaching, I was still figuring out what teaching meant. And also I was in a new space. The first school space that I in was pretty racially diverse. It was actually the school district was experiencing white flight. So there were I got a chance to be there at the tail end where the district was kind of changing demographics. So I had taught in that environment, and then I'm going to this really affluent white space where I'm one of a few teachers of color in a space, and I felt like, oh man, I I kind of have to be and act a certain way in order to be accepted here. And so I didn't lean into who I was for a long time, to be honest. And it was partially because some of the parents that I had were questioning me. Like I felt like I was on a hot seat. Like, oh, what are your credentials to do this? I was constantly having to defend who I was and what I knew, so that created kind of this element of imposter syndrome, and I understand now. And I want to say this for the record: imposter syndrome ain't real. Thank you, Bettina Love, for like really setting me straight about that. As she's talked about the fact that it's not even a thing. We shouldn't feel like as racially minoritized people, we shouldn't feel like the imposters. We've done enough to prove ourselves to be in spaces. But I did feel inadequate, and so it wasn't until I really started branching outside of my school space and getting involved in organizations that were stretching me and pushing me, organizations that put me in the policy arena, organizations that were talking about these subjects that were really mute in my school. My school wasn't talking about anti-racism and have enough. They didn't feel they had enough Black and brown kids to even mention that. So we don't need. That's not even something in
Oh wow.
purview that we have to even mention. And so it wasn't until I expanded that community that I gained a voice, that I saw that, hey, this is a need. This is absolutely a need. And who better to be having this conversation with than the students that I have in front of me, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of their racial identity, regardless of any of those identities, they needed to understand anti-racism.
So you're having these experiences. You're in a majority white populated school for most of your years. So I'm wondering, at what point in your teaching career did you feel that paradigm shift towards anti-racist teaching in your classroom? I don't know, was it year 8, year 10? Like when did you start to feel different in your instructional approach, even in the way that you were interacting maybe with colleagues or administration? So I'm curious to know when that happened.
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say it was probably about year 10. I had joined a policy organization called Teach Plus, and Teach Plus is an organization that gives teachers voice in the policy world. And so joined that organization and really gained access to these amazing educators from around my state who were talking and thinking in ways that I had not taught in before. So it like elevated my game. Like, game on, Keisha. Like these are folks that like you're in the big leagues now. They're talking about some stuff that you really need to be thinking about and considering. And so after joining that organization, I told myself I was going to go through a year of yes. And I was going to say yes to every opportunity that presented itself to grow outside of my school space that pushed me to think differently. And I did that. So I started joining history organizations and National Council for Teachers of English and their Committee Against Racism and Bias, and start really just exploring different avenues. I got on Twitter and became just really active in Twitter spaces that were pushing thinking and ideology. And that's when, oh, the radical Keisha was was birthed at that time. And and if you know that when you change, people don't like change. People want the old Keisha, the Keisha that didn't
Right.
that was just gonna kind of smile and go along with, oh, we're gonna do this lesson plan about Tom Sawyer. No, I'm not doing that lesson plan about Tom Sawyer. No, I'm not doing that. I don't think that that has value for my students. Yeah, I'm going to be over here doing this, or or I just did it, and then my students were so excited and talking about it. The other teachers were, what is she doing in that classroom? What's going on in there? And questioning the things that I was doing, because I was really in a and I'm not saying that I was any better than my colleagues. I had just come to a space where I was thinking of teaching and learning quite differently and evolving in my practice. And I could no longer just go and uphold the status quo in my classroom. And so it really was that just
Mm.
expansion of community that really expanded my knowledge. And then that became a source of tension with administration in my building, because when you're not upholding the status quo, you are now a challenger. You are now the person who, I have a question. So let me ask,
Yep.
let me ask this. So you're the person that's asking the tough questions, and you're the person that everybody else is like, would you just shut up about this already? We only got three black kids. So why you want to talk about the three black kids we got? And so, or why do you want to talk about the dress code policy? It doesn't really, oh my goodness, just uphold it. So it was kind of, I started to become an agitator. And I believe agitation is a great thing because it gives us opportunity to grow. But some administrators don't think that that is the case. And especially when you start thinking about your teaching in culturally sustaining and responsive ways too, you're giving students instruction that looks so different than what other folks are given. And so when the principal came to observe my classroom, some of them were, hmm, what's going on in here? I got a couple of emails. Me, can I see you in my office after school? And just questioning some of the things that I was in the ways in which I was teaching. And I understand that as an administrator, you have to understand. But also my principals didn't feel they had to do the learning because they were in a white space and they didn't see the need for disruption. And so that it became tense in my school, and that was at the point where I knew I had to get out of that space because it wasn't fruitful for me to be there anymore, and it just wasn't an environment that I could really grow in.
And I think oftentimes when you find yourself growing in your consciousness and you're rising above the oppression you're experiencing, you find yourself in a very lonely place because you realize that there are people who either have not reached your level of new consciousness or they're resistant to this new content.
Mhm.
So one of the things that we often experience in this transition is that you're trying to find allies, you're trying to find co-conspirators in this process, and you want them to accelerate their learning at the
Yes,
same rate as you are, but they're not quite catching up to you, even if they have the desire to. And that
exactly.
can grow your frustration. So there is an element of patience that's necessary, but it has to be coupled with urgency as well. And I
Absolutely.
think what tends to happen is we want our colleagues to be on our side, but more times than not, they haven't developed the level of capacity to understand why they should be on our side. And we end up exhausting ourselves and exerting so much energy trying to get them to where we are. And then that thing that just adds to the frustration and it accumulates over time.
Yeah, that part, like that part. Expressly, I think that's why being in a different space propelled that, because I saw that, wait a minute, you're telling me that we can do this work, and I see people that I'm in unity with in rural Indiana, in rural Missouri, in other places across the country doing this, and you're telling me that we can't do this, and we're supposed to be a premier place of learning. So it was like, no, we can do this, and there are people who are learning this stuff, who are like going running circles around me in knowledge and experience that are have far more restrictions than we in the that I was teaching in. So I think that's what also bred also this impatience too, this impatience. And I don't want to belittle my classroom, my colleagues, because I worked with some amazing staff members. So it wasn't. I don't want it to seem like it was the majority of them. It wasn't. I just don't think that it was. We weren't talking about it as a school community in the way we should have been talking about it to promote growth in those amazing educators that were there. And I also think that there was a privilege. The district had this hierarchy, right? So the whiter the school, the more privilege that you had. So I was on the very white socioeconomic side of the district. So there was some that came with that. So even in the district itself, they were creating these hierarchies of whiteness and white supremacy. And so people on our side of the district, people teaching minority white affluent kids didn't feel like they were better than the other people in the district that had to teach those kids. And so it wasn't congruent to what I knew to be good teaching in life.
No, I hear that. I definitely hear that. So you did mention that you realized you had to move away from the classroom and make a transition. And here's what's interesting about when you did it. This is after you received some major accolades, not just within your own state, but national. I mean, you were the Illinois History Teacher of the Year, as well as the National Middle Level Educator of the Year, as awarded by, I think, NCTE, if I'm not mistaken. So all this happened. I would think, as a classroom teacher, that's going to propel me to stay in the classroom and keep me going. But rather, you said, no, I want to make a shift towards act. So talk to me about that. And you did mention a little bit about it earlier, but let's talk about what those honors meant to you at the time that you earned.
Yeah, it was like I appreciated both of these because this wasn't just me writing an essay to be teacher of the year or NCE middle level educator of the year. These were applications included statements from my colleagues, from my students, from people who knew me, my work, and so that is what made these awards like really personal to me, and really just really filled my bucket in that way. I when I was when the Illinois History Teacher of the Year announced, I was still in the middle grades classroom, and it was worth to let me know that it was time to that space because when I was given that award, while my colleagues were wonderful and celebratory, my administration said nothing. There was no email sent. There was no fanfare about that distinction. At that point, I was also helping to develop the Illinois Culturally Responsive Teaching and Leading Standards um, for the state, and there was really no recognition of that. And not that I needed that recognition, but I saw the disparity in the fact that I wasn't given that while some of my colleagues had, who were doing good things, but who had done less were being absolutely recognized. And so I thought, hey, you don't value me. You don't value me here in that space. And as I said, I talked about being in that teacher policy group. We had written a white paper that had gotten some traction about what it means to recruit and retain teachers of color. And I knew that being in the space that I was at, it was so important to just have for students to have teachers
Yeah.
that look like them and that didn't look like them. I had some students tell me, Mrs. Rembert, you are the first teacher of color I've ever had. So Kwame means that they had gone from kindergarten through seventh grade, never having had a teacher of color. And the research tells us that you are more likely to succeed academically and emotionally, regardless of
That's
your
right.
racial identity, when you have a teacher of color. So I was like, wow, I in this classroom, I have great things as one teacher. I cannot, I cannot sit by and just allow my voice to be the only one. I don't know when they're going to have another one of me. I don't know. They've already told me that they've gone 7 years without. So it made sense for me to then migrate to higher ed, and especially in a higher ed setting, that their mission was to really get more teachers of color, racially minoritized teachers into the classroom. So it just made natural sense, that progression. And so I was able to take that knowledge and Kwame, take my awards with me. Forget you, you didn't have to recognize me. I could recognize myself, and I could also be able to speak to a lot more educators about what that means. I love the fact that I had those two very different experiences as an educator. I love that I could speak to the teacher who's taught it, but I could also speak to the teacher who's taught in the burbs. I think that there's power in that, and I think that that story is important for teachers to see and understand. Because Keisha was the same teacher in a lot of instances in those spaces, and that was okay, and she needed to be.
Yeah, for sure. And indeed, you made the right choice making that shift. And since then, you mentioned that you've done a lot of work with Teach Plus, which is a phenomenal organization. I cannot stress that enough. I mean, I know colleagues, even in Massachusetts, who went through that program, and they can't stop raving about how much that organization has elevated their careers and got them to think differently about what it means to be an educator, but more so an activist within the education space, in the fight for liberation and justice. So yeah, shout out to Teach Plus. But I want to make sure that we have time to talk about your book, The Anti-Racist English Language Arts Classroom. And when I think about that title, it should resonate with every educator, because I'm a firm believer in the idea that every educator is a literacy teacher. So I don't care if you're teaching science. I don't care if you're teaching math, like I taught for many years. I don't care if you're teaching history or any of the humanities, or if you're even an art teacher or a PE teacher, whatever your discipline is, there is some element of literacy that has to be taught within your specialized fields. So we all have to be accountable to this task. So I really want you to just spend some time talking with us about what gave you the idea to write the book, number one, but also walk us through that journey of getting it to a place where it's now published and everybody's reading it.
Oh my goodness. That's the scary place. You spend so much time, and you know this, you spend so much time voting
Hmm.
this energy and this learning, and making yourself vulnerable only to burn something. And I'm always like, ooh, don't let them tell me my baby's ugly. Please don't let them tell my baby's ugly. Because I feel like the book is my baby. But what inspired me to write book was really just, again, being part of communities pushed me to think differently, to evolve my practice, and to move beyond the place I was at. So I think about being, I think about reading. I was when I was work at when I was working with Plus, I had never read Paulo Freire before, and somebody mentioned it, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, this is." I had not read it, and I read it, and it was like, boom, mind exploded. And so I started to do more reading and more research. And I started then doing some writing. And that writing really is what propelled publishers to come seek me out and say, would you be interested in writing about anti-racism in the English language arts classroom? I see anti-racism as story. So that is really kind of the premise of my book. And so when I thought about what inspires me to write the book, what inspires me goes back to my grandparents, goes back to my
Hmm.
parents and their stories. So We have racism is our collective story globally. It is our collective story. And so it's important that
That's
we
right.
write that story. And so I think about you talk about we know that all teachers are literacy teachers. I also think that all are history teachers. So this book is could be anti-racist humanities classroom because I want a lot of what I stress is that we can't be ahistoric in our instruction and the stories that we tell students. Um, know, the being able to tell the story of racism and well, first of all, to be able to first ground the story in racism. I never want to start from that deficit ends, but to be able to tell the story of anti-racism and why it is important for our students and what that looks like for future generations. So I'm not just telling this story for the present day. I'm hoping that I'm telling this story and writing this story so that it becomes something that is that future educators can pick up. The future teachers say, "Oh, this instruction should look like. This is what my practice needs to be. This is the story of who I need to be as an educator." A lot of the book is about just our self work and what it means to tell our own stories. Um, Writing the book, I became so engrossed in even my parents and my grandparents' story. What did it mean for them to go to school in the South? And sometimes not go to school in the South. Sometimes they can come in September so that they couldn't. My parents couldn't go to school. They were they had to help support their family. So what does that even look like in me to share that story, but also to share the story of these students? Because I interview a number of students, their voice appears in the book about what they want to in their English language arts classroom. What does anti-racism mean to me, to them? Why do they need anti-racism? And so incorporate the voices of over 100 teachers in the book. Interviewed over 30, a lot of their voices is in it because this is a collective story, right? This is not just Keisha's journey. If this were Keisha's journey, this story wouldn't be applicable, right? I wanted to ensure that telling the story of people from Florida, people from Texas, people from Missouri, people from California. So I wanted to for us to leverage that collective understanding of what it is. It might look one way in my context, and it might look another way in context. And Kwame, you talked about that we're all in different planes, understanding of it. So it's just about picking this book up as you're on a journey and find someone who is on a similar path that you're on and walk that path. Not getting stuck in it, not being fearful. Because I know for a long time I was fearful. I was fearful for what parents might say if they were like, "Oh, that black is teaching things that are indoctrinating children," and I was scared of that. And we can't teach scared. We know that when we teach scared, we're really teaching. And I even know that personally from writing this book. There was a point where I was really scared. I was, why did they approach me to write this book? I am not the person, like, why? I don't know if I can write this book. And it's when I started talking to my colleagues and started talking to educators in this book that I was like, oh, I'm not writing, like, this isn't my book. This is just Keisha's book. It's all of those educators' book that really helped lend their voice and their ideas to move us all forward. So that the journey was beautiful, but it was also was taxing because it is a heavy topic, right? It's a topic that begets a lot of responsibility. So you want to make sure that you're not getting it wrong. That if people are going to pick your book up, they're going to be able to take something from it that's valuable to them and it's valuable to their class. And so I think that was why always like, okay, so what did you get out of it? I'm like, when you read it, what did you think of it? Let's talk. Let's have a conversation about it, because that's what's important to me. That people can pick it up, say, okay, this is what I want to do differently for my students and my.
All right, Keisha. So before we wrap things up. And thank you for taking the time to just share your inspiration behind the book and just some of the lessons that you learned along the way in that journey. But this is a question I like to ask all of my guests, and that is, how do you stay true to the teacher in you, even now?
I think about surrounding yourself with I think staying true to myself means it means sometimes just sitting with myself and questioning myself. So when that students, one of my peers in college asked me that question, I had to sit with that question. I really had to say, Keisha, why haven't you been to any Black student union events? Like, what is going on here? So I had to sit with myself, but then about that community that surrounded me that let me know that it was okay and that I was safe. So I stayed true to myself by first doing what's going on in me, where am I at? Where do I need to be? Where do I want to go? But then also having community that supports me, but also challenges me. That's what propelled me on this anti-racist journey. Those being part of Teach Plus, being part of the Committee Against Racism and Bias for NCTE, being part of a number of different organizations that said it's not okay for you to sit on the sideline. Like, what are you really doing? Like, you have a captive audience. You have a group of students who can really act. So, are you okay just with the status quo? Are you okay with not letting understand racial reality? And so I think it is about your community that supports you and pushes you to be the best you, who says, okay, Keisha, yeah, you're doing a lot, but are you doing enough? Yeah, I think I think that is really important to me, has gotten me to where I am and will hopefully continue to push, motivate those people like Brianna. Shout out to Brianna. Shout out even like my college professor, Dr. Tanner, who really just motivated me and told me, like, just told me, like, you're brilliant, be a brilliant teacher, and like try to see it in me when I didn't see myself. So I think those people who see you for more than you even see yourself.
Yes. And we're going to keep on inspiring people to just do what we need to do for these babies.
Yes.
And that's the work. That's the work right there.
Absolutely. And they have to be part of it. So I talk about my community. My students are a part of that community. I love
Yes.
having communication with my students and for them to say, now will you do that? Or now I'm keeping a buck with you. You should have done A, B, C. And I'm like, okay. Or I haven't seen you at there's a couple organizations on campus that I'm a part of. And I had a student tell me, I haven't seen you. You been? And I'm like, okay, call me out. I love that and I need that. And I'm glad that you have expectations, because those expectations let me know that at some point I was meeting, that I was there, that I was up.
There you go. Wow, Keisha. So we're approaching the end of our time together, and I thank you for taking the time to share your story, to talk about your book and all the great things you're doing. But I can't let you go without giving you a chance to share how people can connect with you on social media, and also how people can get access to your book and purchase it. So if you could just share all the information, that would be wonderful.
Awesome. I am, again, that peer community was so vital for me. So I love to meet people through Twitter and Twitter. My Twitter handle is KL. That is also my IG handle. So I love to share what I'm learning, what I'm learning, because I'm a big proponent of unlearning. So some stuff that we learn that we kind of got to roll back, and so those are the places that I do that, as well as on LinkedIn, which is LinkedIn and Rembert. So those are places that I love to meet people and share. And to you can get my inaugural work, my baby, on Amazon. It is, if you just search my name, Keisha, it will come up, the Anti-Racist English Classroom. But you can also get it from the publisher. So it is published through outlets Eye on Education series. And so if you type in my name there or the title of the book, you'll be able to get it there. And I'm also always love hearing as and their thoughts and questions that they have for me. So if you get a copy of the book and you just want to talk about the book, hit me up. Let's talk about it. I am excited to do that. Kwame knows that once you this book is your lifeblood, or you have been blood, sweat, and tears to it, and you want to be able to talk about the things were ruminating in your head when you were just this when it was just you and a piece of paper. So now when it's a dimensional, it's always good to have other people's perspective for it.
There it is. And that's so true. You spend so much time trying to, birth this book that when it finally comes out, you have to nurture it.
Yes.
You're attached to it and you're doing everything possible to let the people know what this book is and how it's going to impact the world and the different communities that are out there. So yes, all that is true. Whew, Keisha, thank you
Thank
once
you.
again for coming on. And maybe sometime in 2024 we gotta bring you back when you write that second book. See, I'm,
Let's
I'm
do it.
manifesting
Let's
now.
do it. Let's. I want to talk about your book. So maybe we can have a conversation about how our books intersect. I mean,
Yeah,
that would be amazing.
listen, that would be the dopest conversation. And I'm hoping, God willing, that the book is out by the time that we do have the conversation again. But until then, I'm wishing you well. I'm wishing you a wonderful holiday season with your family. If you celebrate the holidays, because we can't assume these days, right? Um, but yeah, so thank you and have a good rest of the day.
All right. Thank you.
All right, y'all. So we're about to end another fantastic episode of our Dance Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.